Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm Diane Sare, LaRouche Independent Candidate for U.S. Senate in the upcoming election on Tuesday. And this is the last symposium that we will be doing prior to the election. However, due to popular demand, the symposia are going to continue after the election because obviously we have a lot to do. Now, I wanted to take up the theme of American history tonight, and particularly the American Revolution, because we're in a very great crisis, and it's not really clear if our republic is going to return to the principles under which it was founded, namely against the British Empire. There's a couple very important developments with regard to the British Empire, also underscoring the importance of a press conference tomorrow at 11 a.m. sponsored by the Schiller Institute that I'll be involved in. We'll come back to that. But as people may or may not be aware, the very short-lived Prime Minister of Great Britain, Liz Truss, managed to incriminate herself and her government and the United States in the explosion that destroyed Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines by sending a text on a non-encrypted cell phone to U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken 1 minute after the explosion occurred, saying it is done. Obviously, this was not lost on the Russians or anyone else in the world. And after that, and after the British were implicated in a terrorist drone attack on the ships in Sevastopol, which are part of the security system for the grain route leaving the Black Sea, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs called in the British ambassador to let her know what kind of evidence they had of the British role and to ensure that this kind of terroristic activity under the supervision and guidance of the British Empire will no longer be tolerated. And I'll just read you from some quotes translated into English, of course, from Nikolai Patrushev, who is the head of the Russian National Security Council, where he said, quote, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, representatives of the British naval forces took part in planning and implementation of the attacks. That's Nord Stream. It is impossible not to pay attention to the SMS message by which that time Prime Minister Liz Truss immediately reports to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken after the gas pipelines were blown up that everything is done. Literally from the first minutes after the reports of the explosions on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines, an active campaign was launched to accuse Russia. However, it is obvious that the main beneficiary of those terrorist attacks is the United States. So think about that. She's texting to Tony Blinken, it's done, and then immediately taking to the airwaves to blame Russia for blowing up its own pipeline. And you have foolish, gullible Americans, many of whom I met down at Chelsea Market when we were protesting Spectrum News's exclusion of myself from the debate, who literally believe that Russia would blow up its own pipeline. And that gets me to something which is extremely important, which is that this question of culture, why is this so important? And I'll tell you, it only dawned on me in the last few years, the significance of the ending of the story of Hans Christian Andersen about the emperor's new suit of clothes. Now, everyone knows the story, but let me remind you, there's a very vain emperor who is spending lots and lots of time and energy and money on having new suits for every possible occasion. He has one suit for breakfast, one for his morning tea, one suit for lunch, one for etc. You get the idea. So he decides to call in a tailor who is going to build him the most exquisite, or design the most exquisite suit of all for all time. And the tailor decides to play a trick, knowing how vain the emperor is. So he pretends that he's making him a suit out of invisible thread, and that anybody who can't see the thread and can't see the fabric is not suited for the office which they are holding. Now, that includes the emperor. So, of course, he doesn't want to admit he can't see it. So he says, oh, it's just beautiful. It's just fantastic. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And everybody in the kingdom gets word that if you can't see the suit, then you really should be fired from your position. So everyone goes along with this until the day the tailor says the suit is complete. People come in and admire it, and the emperor is so pleased that he decides to have a parade where he's going to march in front of everybody in his new suit. So he gets totally naked, except for his underwear. He's marching in his underwear down the street, and a little boy says, "Daddy, the emperor is naked." And then the whole crowd starts laughing. The emperor is naked. But see, here's the thing. That's not the end. The end is that the emperor shrugs his shoulders and continues marching. And the crowd goes along with it. Now, the question we face is, how do we break out of that? We have a situation where the British have been exposed. They are buck naked, exposed before the eyes of the world. That apparently does not guarantee we get off the trajectory we are now on, unless the entire culture, particularly of the Western nations, particularly in the United States, changes so that people are held accountable for their actions. And that's how I wanted to introduce the presentation this evening on the effect of the American Revolution on the world, given by my husband, Christopher Sayre, and Bob Wesser, who's the historian for the Sayre for Senate campaign.
There we go. Okay, so probably most people have seen this. It's a very famous painting of the surrender of Lord General Cornwallis to George Washington at Yorktown in 1781, signifying the victory over the American patriots over the British Empire. Now, if you ask your average American, tell me about the Revolution. So, you know, if they're really well read, they may say, well, that started with the Stamp Act. Or if they're really well read, they'll say it started with the Proclamation of 1763 or something along those lines. And we're going to present tonight a much broader, much more truthful picture on what this entire process was about, because it never, ever, ever was something localized to North America or the English-speaking world, ever. It came out of a centuries-long fight for an idea of what a human being is. What is the, and we take these things for granted. A lot of Americans do anyway. You know, that you can, you know, if you apply your talents, you can become anything. That's of course supposed to be the American dream. So we want to give a picture of this, and I'll just posit this now. What you'll see is that the development of the United States as a revolutionary republic and the development of a modern Russia are actually one and the same process. It's a big statement, but let's see how it works. Chris?
Yeah, so let's take the idea of the United States all the way back to the Golden Renaissance, because that's actually where the United States comes from. It's a project, it's an idea of the Golden Renaissance that Nicholas of Cusa, who was a great scientific and philosophical thinker, wanted to create a republic, but recognized the problem was that Europe was just too oligarchical for anything to be able to take hold. Now, obviously, there was an attempt to do some of these kinds of things with the Golden Renaissance in Italy. And Cusa was very good friends with the leading minds of the Renaissance, specifically Toscanelli, who we'll get to in a second. But I want to go to the next slide. All right, so this is a writing from Nicholas of Cusa. It's the Concordancia Cattolica. In Book 2, he states, and this is in 1434, right? More than 300 years before that other document you see there is written. And he says, hence, since natural law is based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. For since all are by nature free, every governance, whether it consists in a written law or in a living law in the person of a prince, can only come from the agreement and consent of the subjects. So even if you have a prince or a king, his power, her power only comes from the consent of the subjects. That's a pretty advanced idea for 1434. For if men are by nature equal in power and equally free, the true, properly ordered authority of one common ruler, who is their equal in power, can only be constituted by the election and consent of the others, and law is also established by consent. Absolutely amazing. Never, as far as I know, never written before openly like this. This is an idea people may have thought, never laid out in this way. So that's Cusa. Next slide. On his deathbed, it's said that Toscanelli traveled 120 miles to see Cusa. Toscanelli was an astronomer, a map maker, and friends with Brunelleschi, who created the beautiful dome in Florence. These are the circles, Da Vinci. These are the circles that Cusa Toscanelli represent, the highest Renaissance. Toscanelli creates a map of the Americas, and he gives this map to Christopher Columbus. And you can imagine Toscanelli being close friends with Cusa. They've discussed these ideas that Cusa had about what is a republic, what's the nature of man, what's the consent of the governed, etc. They're trying to create a republic, and they can't do it in Europe. So Bob will take it up from here.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. So the project fails because there's an oligarchy that's opposed to it. That should be obvious, or maybe it's not, but and that oligarchy plunges Western Europe and European civilization into horrific, bloody religious warfare. All sorts of, aristocracies opposing each other, et cetera. It's a mess. But the one man, as part of a grouping that emerges out of this to care to take up the mantle of this project, of this Cusanus project, is the gentleman on the left there, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And you can see what he says here, what's his idea is here. This is from a letter he actually writes to the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great. And he says, I regard the arts and the sciences as a higher calling, since through them the glory of God and the best interests of the whole human race are continuously promoted. And at the end, he says, and what am I doing? I'm scouring the planet for a leader of a nation. I've been in touch with people in Europe, in China, in You know, I'm ahead of the Prussian Society of Sciences, etc. So he is looking everywhere in the world to let this seed take hold. The other people you see there, Leibniz was part of a scientific Renaissance grouping centered around the French Academy of Sciences. That's Colbert in the center, the great Dutch scientist Huygens. So let me just go back here. Whoops, wrong way. And he writes various papers about this. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but essentially what he's doing is trying to establish or set up the idea of what we would later call Republican institutions. What institutions do we need to foster this idea of a modern society, of this image of man? Improve schools, improve arts and sciences, improve schools as universal education, right? Poetry, logic, etc. Manufacturers. We have to create manufacturers, machines that do the work of men instead of slavery. Improve trade between countries, etc. And he has a very, very clear global strategic idea on how this might all come together. This is a very famous, we've made it famous, quote from a publication that he put out on China, on studies on Chinese culture and civilization called Novissima Sinica, which is on the lower left there. Leibniz was in touch with top missionaries and thinkers, Christian thinkers, who were in China and had been studying Confucius. And here's what he says. I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement so that as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their hands to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. So this is his conception. All right. And there's a lot of aspects of this, but there's three major kind of offensive prongs here, a triad, if you will. One, of course, is his work with China. And this is not a small thing, because you have these reactionaries in the West that are saying they're heathens. That's not compatible with Christianity, crusades or whatever, right? And Leibniz does an entire study on this, which is fascinating in itself to read. And Russia, and I'll come back to that. Russia? Why Russia? We'll see. And then what Chris alluded to around the Cusa project in Tuscany. Look, we have a whole continent over here. Nobody's here. No kings, no queens, no nobles, no aristocrats. It's a blank, it's a tabula rasa, if you will, in which we can maybe make these ideas take root. And Leibniz is very deeply involved in that project, which begins in the 17th century, in the 1630s with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We published an entire book. This book is available on the EIR store, Executive Intelligence Review store. It's well worth reading. It goes through all of this history by the late historian H. Graham Lowry. But why Russia? So what's the deal with Russia here? Well, what does he say? What's his conception here? China and Europe, as the most extreme ends of the world, would be brought together through the mediation of the Tsar of Russia. Now, this is actually him writing to the Russians. Leibniz had over 240 letters and documents directly to top people around Peter the Great, including Peter the Great, who we met at least 4 times, I forget. He says, by this means, Chinese products and news from China could come to Europe through Russia. And on the other hand, the Christian faith could spread to China, indeed through Moscow as the mediator. The prerequisite for this would be that we bring to Moscow, we bring to Russia, all the institutions which we have in Europe. Now, of course, he means the Leibnizian institutions, the ideas of the scientific Renaissance that he's part of. And then he says to Peter directly, Your Majesty, you could attach China and Europe with one another. So that's his conception. Now, there's another part of this, which Leibniz is absolutely adamant about. He says, look, we got to make maps and we got to get out there across Siberia and find out, is there, of course, from that standpoint, you're looking for a northeast passage across Siberia into North America. And it's absolutely explicit. We have to learn if Asia is joined to America and if we can switch between them, right? And then later he calls for a expedition, which essentially would go around the what would be the Arctic Ocean. You know, is there an all-water route from the Arctic all the way to North America, or is the ice there? You know, this we have to discover. Later, after Leibniz dies, the year that Peter the Great dies, this becomes the Bering expedition, which goes almost to Alaska. They get pretty close. But this is his idea. Oh, this actually have a slide of that. There's Vitus Bering. It's a 5-year expedition. And you can see there, that's the Bering Straits. But the upshot of this whole thing, which is a whole story in and of itself, is the creation in 1725, the year of Peter's death, Peter the Great's death, of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And it is indeed a conglomerate of the best ideas and minds of Western Europe, of around the circles of Leibniz and Colbert and Huygens, etc., who actually come to St. Petersburg, and they establish this Academy of Sciences as a center for mediating Western civilization into the East and back and forth. So that's his idea. That's what he's trying to create. And Chris.
So what's the enemy do? You know, I mean, there's always the point that we want to bring out. You know, you hear today, Russia's the enemy, China's the enemy. No, you know what? You know who the enemy is? It's the empire system. It's the British Empire. It's been our enemy. It's still our enemy. And this is a map that I just want to show you. Go back to the map. Yeah, this is a map that I just want to show you of the British Empire later on, but it gives you a sense of how this thing works. Controlling the seas, controlling trade. What's Leibniz working on? What is the idea? It's internal improvement. Sure, it's what we're going to see in terms of sea routes, but it's internal improvements of the interiors of the nations. And that's what the United States does later, which is a whole other story, but it's critically important that it was about the development of the interior of the nations and scientific progress and freeing mankind from this British Empire system. That's the issue. So next slide. Now, I want to introduce to you so you have John Winthrop. He's from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And of course, Ben Franklin is born in Boston, 1706. He's born in Boston. He comes from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. His mentors, you know, Cotton Mather, the Essays to Do Good, John Winthrop Jr., who dies before Franklin's born, but who was in correspondence with Leibniz. And then Franklin, as a young man, goes to Philadelphia, as people may know. And James Logan in Philadelphia was one of the key people who collected the works of Leibniz in his library and fought to keep Leibniz's writings alive. And what Franklin is the heart and soul of the creation of this nation. Of course, he never became president, but many people know the role that he played in terms of the Constitutional Convention, all of the diplomatic work that he did. But one of the key things that he did long before the Republic was ever created was he created in 1744 the American Philosophical Society. And this is like the Academy of Sciences in Russia, That's the Academy of Sciences to the United States. Franklin is pooling together the best scientific minds in the United States, but he's also in dialogue with the greatest scientific minds around the world. And so go to the next slide, please. So he is in touch, and he goes to England. He makes 2 trips to England. On his second trip to England here, in the 1760s, he's working with the leading scientists and industrialists like Matthew Boulton, James Watt, and many, many other scientists of the day, and also with the circles around Brindley, who are building canals and power plants, water power to run industrial mills and lifting up the living conditions of the population. And Franklin is trying to organize England to break from being an empire to being a republic. That's his first attempt, short of a revolution in the United States, or in the colonies, I should say. What if we could organize England to become a republic? Well, we know this fails, but it was his attempt. And while he's over there, he also goes to Germany and meets with the leading scientists of Germany who are reviving the writings of Leibniz, the new essays on human understanding, for example, translated, which have been completely, literally sequestered by King George I and held by the British royals, and it gets re-released through the circles that Franklin's working in. So he's consciously in the circles that are bringing back Leibniz. So next slide, please. Now, Ezra Stiles, who's from Yale University, who's a friend of Franklin's, a scientist himself, he writes a letter to Lomonosov, who is the polymath, the Ben Franklin of Russia of the time. And Lomonosov is working on a project of getting a ship through Siberia to the other side of America, to Alaska as we know it. And Stiles writes a letter to him saying, "I have read in the London Gazette that you believe it possible to discover a route from Russia to America across the ice-covered seas, and have prepared 2 ships to do this." He then gives this letter to Ben Franklin and asks if Franklin would be so kind as to deliver this letter to Lomonosov. So obviously Franklin's in touch with these Russian scientific circles, or Stiles would have never asked him to deliver this letter. Unfortunately, Lomonosov dies, but next slide. Admiral Chikagov is the admiral who is organizing this expedition that Lomonosov set into motion to find this Northwest Passage. And he does it. And he ultimately lands in Alaska. You can see the map here. That's the North Pole right in the center. So you can see how the ships went right along the northern part of Russia and actually landed in Alaska. So this was of tremendous interest. Go to the next slide, please. So I want to introduce to you two scientists from the Russian Academy of Sciences. Franz Aquinas is obviously not Russian. He's one of these Leibnizian minds of Europe who is brought into the Russian Academy of Sciences, and Dmitry Golitsyn, who is Russian. Ben Franklin is in dialogue with Aquinas about electricity, 1766. He writes to Aquinas, "When last in America, I received there your excellent work on the theories of electricity and magnetism, which I understand you did me the honor to send." And so it's with infinite satisfaction, et cetera, et cetera. He goes on. There's a dialogue going on between Franklin and the scientific minds of Russia, as well as other nations. So go ahead to the next slide. So these great scientific minds are in the circles of advisors to Catherine the Great of Russia. She is Peter the Great's granddaughter, and she is carrying on a tradition of Peter the Great and the Russian Academy of Sciences. Now she's an empress, so you can imagine she would have trepidation about a Jacobin style revolution, etc. But she's very intently interested in what's going on in the colonies, in the American colonies. And there's go to the next slide. These are some of her advisors. Musin Pushkin, who is the ambassador to England, who's writing to her all of the developments in the American Revolution, the leading up to the American Revolution and the Revolution. And if you read his letters to her, you get like a history of what's going on. Now he is in England, so he's hearing it through the British eyes. But you can tell from what he writes to her, he's not upset about the revolution that's going on. And he writes to this gentleman, Panin, who creates the College of Foreign Affairs, which is a body that is advising Catherine the Great on every step of her policy, foreign policy, etc. Okay, next slide. So this is funny. King George III, who is in big trouble because the American colonies are revolting. He writes a letter to Catherine on September 1st, 1775. He says, "I accept your offer to assist me with a certain portion of your troops, which unfortunately may be necessary as a result of the rebellious activities of my subjects in certain of my American colonies." Now, she writes back, "I'm so glad to hear from you, brother. You know, I'm glad that you trust me so much. Your Majesty has just informed me by his letter and by the requests of his minister that on the basis of these assurances on my part," these are past assurances of military aid, etc., "that you expect a corps of 20,000 of my troops to be transported next spring to Canada. I cannot conceal from you that such assistance with such a destination not only changes the meaning of my offers, but also exceeds the limits of my power to serve you." And she says, "We're just beginning to enjoy peace, blah, blah, blah. Good luck." Next slide. Meanwhile, Golitsyn is now the Russian ambassador to The Hague. John Adams is at The Hague at the time. Golitsyn is writing to Ben Franklin in 1777 in the middle of the revolution. And, here he is, this revolutionary upstart who's in France at the time, who's also talking to the Russian ambassador to France quite a bit. And Golitsyn writes to Ben Franklin in the middle of this, "I dare to flatter myself, sir, that you will not disapprove of the liberty I take to write to you without having in any way the advantage of being known to you. As one of your most sincere admirers, I thought I could allow myself this approach, that of loving the sciences and of truly taking an interest in their progress, even gives me the right to address myself to you. Who better than you, sir, could decide if the ideas that I have formed of positive and negative electricities and of the attractive powers of the points are correct or not?" So that's the scientific correspondence going on between ambassadors from Russia and this great ambassador to Europe, to France, from the Americas. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. So George Washington writes, hearing about what's going on in Russia, that there is this this friendly attitude. He writes to Lafayette in 1779, "We are not a little pleased to find from good authority that the solicitations and offers of the court of Great Britain to the Empress of Russia have been rejected," right? Sending the troops over. And Washington to George Clinton, the governor of New York, he says that the city of Amsterdam has prepared a form of a treaty with America to be proposed to the States General, that the Empress of Russia has positively refused to enter into any subsidiary treaty with Great Britain, and has motivated her refusal in terms of breathing a generous regard to the rights of mankind. She has motivated her refusal in terms breathing a generous regard to the rights of mankind. That's George Washington's view of Catherine the Great. All right, next slide. So Panin, Osterman, these are the key advisors to her in this College of Foreign Affairs. And they basically just say to her, she asks for their view of what's going on in the United States with the revolution. And they just say, look, we don't think that the colonies breaking free from England is going to have any negative effect on Russia. In fact, it could have a positive effect in terms of trade and breaking the control that the British have on trade. So next slide. So these two gentlemen, Galitzin and Aquinas, these scientists, friends of Ben Franklin, write a document called the League of Armed Neutrality. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the critical sections from the League of Armed Neutrality, 1780. She, Catherine, finds these principles registered in the natural law of peoples, which every nation is justified to demand for itself, and which the belligerent powers cannot ignore without violating the laws of neutrality and without disavowing the rules which they themselves have adopted in diverse treaties and public commitments. Next slide. They are reducible to the following points. 1, that neutral vessels may navigate freely from one port to another and along the coasts of nations at war. 2, that the effects belonging to the subjects of the belligerent powers may pass inviolably on neutral ships, with the exception of contraband merchandise. 3, that the Empress, as to the specifications of the above-mentioned merchandise, adheres to what is stipulated in Articles 10 and 11 of her Treaty of Commerce with Great Britain, extending these obligations to all powers at war. 4, that in order to determine what is a blockaded port, one ought to characterize as such only theirs where the attacking power has stationed its vessel sufficiently near and in such a way as to render access thereto clearly dangerous. So saying trade can go on. England does not have the right to block trade during this revolution, during the American Revolution. So go to the next slide, please. So to get a sense of this, this is a cartoon. It's called The Man in the Nightshirt, or The Smothered Hubris. And this is a cartoon which describes what the Treaty of Armed Neutrality actually meant. Now, what this shows is a man in the nightshirt. You can see the man in the nightshirt there, right? That represents England being attacked by several men representing the countries of the Armed Neutrality League and its allies. He is held by a Swede and a Dane. A Frenchman places a fool's cap on his head. A Dutchman places shackles around his ankles. An American runs away with his clothes, and a Russian is about to hit him with a club. And in the background, a merchant fleet sails out to sea. Next slide. So, one of the last things that Benjamin Franklin does before he passes away is he admits Yekaterina Dashkova, who is a very, very close confidant of Catherine the Great, into the American Philosophical Society. He makes her a member. And she makes Ben Franklin a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. On what power does she do this? She is the head of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So Russia's view of women was pretty high between Catherine the Great and Yekaterina Dashkova being the head of the scientific body of Russia. I think that's important to note. So I think, Bob, you can take it away from there.
Yeah, so this does not end. This collaboration continues. There's a whole story with John Quincy Adams. The scientific collaboration continues. And some of the highlights, people may know something about this, is, of course, the role of Alexander II in Russia in the American War of Insurrection, where essentially the Russians sent it was not clear that the British and the French would not come in on the side of the Confederacy. It was absolutely not clear. It was up in the air. It was dicey, especially after the first year and a half of the war, when things weren't going so well for the Union. But the Russians were absolutely clear. We are never going to recognize anything but the legitimate United States of America. And they even sent the Navy over here to New York in 1863 as a demonstration of that support. And that really is what, in a big way, turned the British and the French away from any idea that, okay, forget it. We're not going to get into war now with Russia over this. We can't do it. And of course, Alexander II was also responsible for all sorts of modernization reforms, including the freeing of the serfs, etc. But again, at the existential crisis of the United States, the War of Insurrection, the Russians are on board. They're there. And before I mention this, people know about World War II. Well, of course, these days maybe they don't. But it was, of course, the alliance and the wartime collaboration between Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. And it was the Russians that really took the brunt of the Nazi war machine and beat it on the Eastern Front. And Roosevelt's collaboration with Russia, with Stalin, which freed the world, saved the world from fascism. But I have to say, even before that, there was never a time, and I've done a lot of reading on this, there was never a time Stalin, Lenin, they were absolutely clear. The United States is not our enemy. And there's a very famous document that was put out at one of their plenary sessions in 1919, where they basically say, friendly collaboration with the United States is vital to the foreign interest of the Soviet Union. This is the beginning of the Soviet Union. These are the communists, right? They're supposed to be against the evil capitalists. Why? Because they admired the entrepreneur scientific spirit. I'm getting the quotes wrong, but there's documentation of this, of the United States. That's during the Bolshevik Revolution. So there was never a point really where this was broken, despite all of the propaganda. And people alive today, the boomers, the Gen X's, etc., have been so inundated with the Cold War propaganda that people have they have no idea of this. This is a meeting that Putin spoke at in June of this year. This is the 350th birthday anniversary of Peter the Great. And he was pretty explicit. You see on the bottom, he says, nearly 3 centuries ago, Peter I issued an order to institute the Academy of Sciences. Since that time, the works, research, and discoveries of our scientists have been serving the progress of Russia and all of mankind. So this is very clear in their minds that this is the identity of Russia. This is what we're going to perpetuate. And well, this is very interesting. Remember Leibniz's idea of, Russia being kind of the mediator between China and the West. And, there's never been a point now as now of such a productive collaboration between Russia and China. Here's Xi Jinping and Putin. So, wherefore the United States? The top picture is Lyndon LaRouche at a press conference in Moscow in the 1990s. LaRouche, and that's a whole longer story, but was at the center of reviving this scientific collaboration. He spoke at agencies of the Academy of Sciences in Russia. He was close with the top minds. On the bottom there is the Senate candidate for New York State, Diane Sawyer. Some people may know her with Lyndon LaRouche. Now here's something interesting. Wow, press coverage. Oh, is this CBS? Is that the New York Times? No. Oh, it's Sputnik. It's RT. Wow. It's the Russian media with wonderful coverage. Look at that. U.S. Senate candidate. Washington must end military aid to Ukraine. Stop conflict. Bottom right is an interview with RT, Russia Today. So here's Diane's campaign being covered in the Russian media. Well, what about the media in the United States? Oops. I guess it's autocratic censorship. So, of course, there was a debate held between the so-called candidates running for U.S. Senate, right? And, no Diane Sawyer. She's censored. So this is quite a twist, quite an irony. And it's really becoming, and I'll close with this, I think it's really becoming way, way, way too much for a lot of Americans to stomach at this point, because it's brought us, as Diane was saying at the beginning, to the brink of nuclear war. So the good news is we just have to go back to being the American of Leibniz and Franklin and the American Revolution and Lincoln and Diane and Lyndon LaRouche, and we're all set. There you go. So that's what we got.
Great. Well, thank you, Jose. I think we can all three be up here for a while. Yes, great. So, well, I have a question for both of you. Whenever you started working on this material, what would you say was the most surprising thing that you discovered?
To me, yeah, I mean, to me, the most exciting thing, there was a footnote in an article that one of our collaborators had written in Campaigner magazine about this, about the Civil War, and there was a footnote about this guy Aquinas. It was even spelled differently than the way it's normally spelled. So I looked up Aquinas once I could figure out how his name is actually spelled, and there was this amazing treasure trove of documentation that had been written by the Russians, actually put together by the Russians over a period of time during the Cold War. There was this 1,200-page book of letters back and forth between Franklin and Aquinas and all of these diplomats, the Russian diplomats to the College of Foreign Affairs, etc. And it had been put together. And all this original source documentation. And it was absolutely amazing to me because this has been completely covered up. And then Bob and I just started digging and looking through more of this stuff. And a lot of the problem is that the Cold War had just smashed it, had blocked it out. And some of the people that wrote about it, the Russians that wrote about it, during the Cold War, they're very defensive in one sense. It's kind of remarkable. They're defensive, but they're trying to revive, trying to bring out this fact that there was this tremendous cooperation and friendship between the United States and Russia. Even in the Cold War, they were trying to bring it out. And unfortunately, the Cold Warriors in the United States had just really decided they were going to root it out and block it from being known to the average American. So I'm really happy that we uncovered it and are bringing it out. And we intend to do much more on this.
Yeah, just one other thing, side point on that, which is important, is that the guy that did this, the Russian, this was done with official collaboration of the United States government, the Office of National Archives, I believe. And this was done in the 70s around the attempted kind of detente around Skylab and all this other kind of stuff. So you see, it never went away. So there was an American component to that. So I just thought that was interesting also.
That is interesting, because I know also there are so many Americans following RT and Sputnik and really happy with the kind of things that President Putin is saying about the destruction of the culture, for example, among other things. So you just see a kind of natural affinity. I mean, I'll just say, when people say, respond or don't understand why I oppose giving billions of dollars to Nazis in Ukraine for a proxy war with Russia, they say, oh, you're more of an isolationist. And that's not the point at all, because you see how nations collaborate, but they collaborate through individuals. And I think this question of scientific progress, building on breakthroughs made in other nations, like the concept of transcontinental railroads and things like that, is really it's really important. And people just, nobody knows this today. When you think of American history, somehow you think of our nation as this little isolated place, that this was not happening in the context of the planet as a whole. And that's the same thing today.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of we talked about this before in a couple of the shows that Bob did and then I did one week after on the Army Corps of Engineers, and the point was made that George Washington Whistler, the Army Corps engineer, who had been involved in many infrastructure projects in the United States, internal improvements, he ended up dying in St. Petersburg. He went in 1849. He went to Russia and worked on the Moscow to St. Petersburg Railroad, which was commissioned by, I forget exactly which Tsar it was. It was before Alexander II, I think. Although maybe it was Alexander II. But then later on, you have the Transcontinental Railroad, which of course Lincoln created. In the middle of the Civil War, he's pushing for the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, which is a remarkable thing in and of itself. He recognized how important that was. He frees the slaves, and his friend Tsar Alexander II, who's sending over the Russian ships to defend the Union and threaten, give the British and the French oligarchs a bloody nose if they even attempt to come in on the side of the Confederacy and break the country apart. He starts the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Again, this idea of internal improvements, developing the nation, a commitment to the general welfare of the population, lifting up the living conditions of the population.
So how do you think, well, who were the British working with? Were they working with anyone or just subjugating people?
What? When? You mean
during the time of the American Revolution, say, and after, up through the War of the Rebellion?
Well, I mean, remember, the British Empire became only existed because anything good in there was wiped out. This is around the time of Henry VIII, the Reformation, and there was a Venetian takeover, which created the British Empire. So it was Venice on the Thames, essentially. And what is the Venetian Empire? It's a global slave empire. So automatic, and it's never been anything since then, to this day. Even though there's been some, glimpses of sanity here and there, maybe, I guess. So that is the inherent of the oligarchical system. So therefore, anything that was backward in that sense, like the Confederacy, for example, the Confederate States of America, they naturally would ally with. And that's what you find throughout history. So,
but as the British, we have no permanent allies, only permanent interests, right? So there's not, even with the Dutch, I mean, you have the Anglo-Dutch Empire that Lynn talks about, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. Sure, they were, the glorious revolution of 1688 when William of Orange comes in, and it's a slime mold of oligarchy.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, that's what I was.
Nations.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, it's like a fungus. It's something that just, that grows off of decaying matter or something. And it's the time is over for this. You can't have these two worlds anymore working with each other. And the idea that the United States has somehow become a tool of this is just despicable. It's just revolting. Any patriot should be, joining the Sayre campaign or doing something, So our time is definitely coming. And the thing I just thought was so fascinating about all of this, because the Leibniz Russia thing was much more in depth than I had ever imagined. This went out in over 25 years, hundreds of documents. Now, the problem is they're only in French and Russian and German, right? I guess most of them are German and French and then Russian. So it would be a great project for somebody to translate all of these documents into English and do an entire study of this, because Leibniz is the philosophical father of the American Revolution, and he is the father of modern Russia, as Putin acknowledges it. So I think there's a lot of rich material here that still has to be looked at and developed.
And what about Leibniz in China?
Same thing, although that's more, I mean, he wrote people can get this. You can buy it online for cheap. It's called The Natural Theology of the Chinese. So he wrote an entire essay. It's basically a book-long essay on proving, he got mediated through these Jesuit missionaries, basically the core ideas of Confucius. And he very rigorously goes through these conceptions, these Confucian conceptions, and shows how they are compatible with the Christian view. And he was involved in this for years. That's why he put out a whole publication, Novissima Sinica. This is a periodical. So again, this is worth studying for people today, although a lot of Americans see, this is the whole thing. This is why naturally, when we had the American Revolution, you had these missionaries. They said, oh my gosh, look at this, China. What a wonder. We got to go over there. We got to give them these ideas. And it's all very natural that Russia, China, the United States are joined as a project to build civilization. That's the history.
People definitely don't have that sense now. There's been a great amount of effort put into destroying that.
Certainly has.
Really something. Well, we have a big job to do. Any other thoughts about all of this?
Yeah, here, I got my 250 shirt on. See? Now, one thing I can report on you, where I am here, this is like the spine of the American Revolution. The interest, the excitement around the 250th is unbelievable.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I'm part of a reenactment group. We've been going to schools. We were just at a top boarding school, like a kind of a private school, and they were just completely fascinated. There's a whole project here up in Saratoga County around the 250th, and it's building across the country. It's not, remember, it's only 1772 right now. So right. So 2026 is the actual 1776, and then you got 250, 77, the Battle of Saratoga. So I think we can use this as a way to take our country back. And a lot of young people, kids, the number of kids that are coming out to these things is incredible. And I mean, like elementary school and, high school kids, junior high kids, et cetera. We had one kid who I think he was 11. He goes, I want to join your group, and fire the cannon. I said, well, yeah, but I think, we're finding this everywhere, and I think we can spread that and use that to revive these ideas.
Yeah, I think it might help us purge our various institutions of the British liberal ideology.
Yeah, right, because you find that they come out and they start defending, as you found, right? They'll actually start coming out defending the British. I think we found that on a couple of occasions.
We had that at the State House meeting state legislators. I had people who thought Aaron Burr was better than Alexander Hamilton. I was blown away. Right. Really horrible.
Right.
They don't know anything about this. But then you understand what really made our nation so great, which is exactly the thing that's been so destroyed, because we have become our opposite. We've become exactly everything that we fought the revolution against.
Yep.
Yeah, and if you look at the what Leibniz writes on society and economy, and then compare it to Hamilton, it's right there. This is so. But the other thing, I think, two things came to mind. The 250, this Battle of Saratoga. This was an incredible turning point. This was the battle that Franklin was able to use to basically pull the French in on the side of the United States, and well, to fully back the revolution. But just like Britain had their slime mold, Franklin was running around organizing people of a like mind, of a Republican with a small r concept of mankind, the Lafayettes, the Beaumarchais, so I think, we can make this, we can educate Americans, but we can also create a resurgence on the planet, because Diane, your campaign has truly become international. It's an absolutely international campaign. Nothing national about it, except that, it would save our nation. If you were to get into the Senate, it would save our
figure.
But the whole friggin' world would rejoice, and people could get back to the best tradition, as opposed to the British bringing out the pig, as they call it, which they do studies on, how do we bring out the worst in every culture imaginable to destroy places? Well, this American outlook could bring out the best. And, and I think we also have a chance to really slay the left-right garbage, because, the American Revolution is not left or right. The American Republic is not left or right. It is the American Republic. It's the American system. It is the higher principle of organizing society that is not left or right. Left and right are insane concepts based on the French Parliament seating arrangement. And anybody who doesn't know that, you should just think about that when you consider that, oh, I'm on the right or I'm on the left. Well, that's the French Parliament seating arrangements. It has absolutely no bearing on the ideas that created our nation. None. I don't care if you consider yourself the most patriotic right-winger, you're still locked in you're locked in a system that has nothing to do with what created the United States. So on the one hand, you have the left, who we can liberate from their absolute hatred of the United States, because they say, oh, the United States was an imperialist, warmongering nation. Well, it wasn't always. I mean, yeah, we've become that in the recent period, but it was not. It was not founded to be that. It was not the greatest leaders of the United States. Washington, John Quincy Adams is a really underrated president, which we really got to bring out. Lincoln, FDR, John F. Kennedy. These were not imperialists. These were Americans. They wanted to liberate mankind from the British system. And we can also free those on the right who say the United States is the best, period, no matter what. No, what do you mean, no matter what? What if we become rotten? Still going to say we're the best? No, if you love this country, you've heard this, it's my country, right or wrong. That's this jingoistic thing. Well, that's only half of the quote. My country, right or wrong. If right, to be kept right. If wrong, to be set right. And that's the real patriotic mission that we have. So I think we can free people from all kinds of stupid ideas and liberate them to become Americans again.
Well, that's certainly the idea. And I think this press conference tomorrow at 11 a.m. will be part of that. Also, I've been part of recently a series of conferences that have involved many nations from Ibero-America, of members of Congress of nations in South and Central America. Now, Europe, it's growing to a worldwide movement of world citizens and patriots of each nation, because once you start talking about nuclear war, that's where we're all in the same boat. And I don't know if people watching got to see the conversation I had yesterday with Steve Starr on what happens. He showed a few things, but if you dropped a nuclear bomb on Manhattan or detonated it about 1 mile above the city, it quickly laid to rest any of the silly stories in the New York City Department of Emergency Management public service announcement. There's not going to be survival. And as I forget, was it Kennedy who made the point that the people who don't die instantly will have it much worse than the ones who did? The starvation, the darkness, the climate change. I mean, you want to talk about climate change. Have a nuclear war, that'll take care of that. So that's what we're on the cusp of, but we're also on the cusp of what you said. I love the idea of working for the 250th anniversary of our revolution. Everyone should be prepared for that. People should memorize things. We had so many great orators, so many great philosophers, really. People should memorize parts of speeches and immerse themselves in the history of the country. We really need it. How much did Ben Franklin know Leibniz? They seem to me to be very similar when you look at their views of China and Russia, for example.
Well, remember, when he went over there in 1965 and got dressed down by the British Parliament, he had a week-long meeting with Abraham Kastner, who was Leibniz's translator, who put out those new essays of human understanding, and a fellow by the name of Raspe. We wrote a whole article about this, which you can make available to people, which is in the Fidelio magazine. So these are the people that were solely responsible for the revival of Leibniz, who he knew personally and had who knows how hours of discussions with. So he was extremely familiar with the ideas directly. This is not some indirect thing. So,
right, that's important to know. There's a little bit of dispute about Leibniz and his role.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that in the chat, and I mean, to the gentleman who raises that, we can put some links in there of things that we've written on the whole question of what Bob just referenced. But also, I would just raise this question of life, liberty, and property versus life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because this whole, I mean, what were the essays on human understanding? The new essays on human understanding. Well, they were a refutation of John Locke's essays on human understanding, right? So Leibniz, what Leibniz does is he takes this sense certainty, bestial view, Aristotelian tabula rasa, bestial view of mankind, and he rips it apart in a Socratic dialogue, point by point by point. And remember what I said earlier, this is true. When he died, his writings became the property of King George I, and they literally put them in a vault and said, we don't have to worry about those ideas anymore. We're going to erase Leibniz from all human knowledge. But it didn't work. He had followers who got his writings out and got them to the Americas, like James Logan and others who did get these writings. And this whole idea of the pursuit of happiness versus property, because the life, liberty, and property is a John Locke concept, but life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, felicity, is a Leibnizian idea. And so people who say that the nation was founded on Locke, I think you're wrong. And I think that, we were directly founded on the opposite of Locke. And we've written a lot about it, and I'd be happy to put those links in there, and we can further the discussion on it.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. We'll be in a different place by next Friday. Although given everything crazy going on, we may not know who's won any of these elections. So everyone should be ready for that possibility. But we are going to ensure that the British Empire actually is defeated and the United States, as it was intended, is restored. So I'd encourage everyone to join me tomorrow at 11 a.m. You can go to the Schiller Institute to see information on that press conference, which will include myself, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Scott Ritter, Colonel Richard Black, Colonel Alain Corvez, Cliff Kirikoff, Steve Starr, many others. And have fun, and I hope you're going to work your rear ends off this weekend. We have a lot of literature to get out, so anyone who needs to keep busy, please send an email to sareforsenate.com, sign up. We need people to help move all this literature in our last sprint to Tuesday. So thanks a lot.